Okay, my name is Carter McKeon. I'm interviewing Charles Howard. We are at the Texana Room in Fondren Library, Southern Methodist University. Today is April 27th, 2018. And would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Charles Howard. I'm a Dallas resident. I'm an SMU graduate. Graduated from undergraduate in 1972 and then from the SMU Law School in 1975.
Okay, great. So before we get started with information about SMU, which is the focus of the project, would you like to tell me a little bit about you as a person, your background? Let's start with when and where were you born?
I was born in Dallas, Texas. Lived in Dallas pretty much all my life. I've lived away. I lived in Ohio for a brief period of time and Kansas City for a brief period of time. But for the most part, I've lived here in Dallas, Texas. I grew up with a brother who also went to SMU, as I mentioned earlier, I went to law school here. So when I got out of when I graduated from law school, I went to work for, actually I had gotten a scholarship to go to law school from, my father worked for Sun Oil Company at the time, and so they gave me a scholarship to go to law school. And so when I got out of school, they offered me a job, so I worked at Sun Oil for a while. I thought when I first got there that I'd work, there a couple of years. I wasn't interested in practicing oil and gas law. That was not something I had an interest in. But since they offered me a scholarship, I had spent 7 years in school. I thought it'd be nice to get out of school for a few years, make a little money, and then I always thought that I would be somebody who worked for legal aid or, that kind of thing. And I always thought that I would go do that. But after I got to Sun Oil, 1 year turned into two turned into three. Next thing I know, I was in there like 7 or 8 years. And subsequently, I changed careers. I wasn't as excited about being an attorney as I thought I would be. So I went back to graduate school, got a degree in sport management, ended up working at the NCAA for a couple of years. Well, not a couple of years, a little over a year and a half. And from there, when I left the NCAA, I got hired by SMU to be their compliance officer, NCAA rules compliance officer. So I worked here at SMU in the athletic department for 10, 11, 12 years or so. And from there, I've done different things. I've done some legal practice. I haven't had a private practice. I've always worked for somebody else, and so I'm not quite sure what else you need to know. But basically, I'm an attorney. I've practiced law. Now I'm retired, although I still do some legal work for people that I know. I'm not soliciting clients or that kind of thing, but there are people that I know, relatives, friends, former clients who I will still do things for. But basically I'm trying to live a nice, fun, retired life where I can, come do stuff like this in the middle of the day, go to the gym, so I'm good.
Okay, great, thank you. And then let's take it back a little bit. So you mentioned you had a brother. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Dallas and your family situation.
Okay, growing up in Dallas, I presume it's still the case, but at least back then, it was very common for, particularly in African American families, for people to have extended families or live in extended families. For example, my brother and I lived with my grandparents and my father, because he and my mother got divorced, and somehow we ended up with my father, and we lived with my grandparents. And so we grew up in, at the time, I had no concept of being poor, or, we had food to eat, we had a roof over our heads. So later on in life, after I got a little older and went to high school, I went to Irving High School, which was pretty much an all-white high school. There were like 4 African Americans in my class. So I started to get a little different perception of things. But I mean, as far as growing up, my brother and I, thought that we, had a great life when we were growing up. In comparison to what some other people's, lives in Dallas was like, looking back in hindsight, we were relatively poor people, didn't have a lot, but, had the basics, and, we were both happy children. We fought like cats and dogs, my brother and I. We made the mistake of buying a car together. I think I was a senior in high school, and I think he was a junior. And my brother and I are very different kind of people who have very different interests. And so it was cool when we wanted to go in the same direction, but when we wanted to go in different directions, we were always fighting over whose turn it was to have the car. But I guess that's not that uncommon with, I don't know if you have brothers and sisters, if you could imagine the two of you or with one of your brothers and sisters trying to share a car, that could create some controversies. Yeah, so that's pretty much all that I can think of. My brother is a year younger than I am, and even though we fought like cats and dogs, he kind of looked up to me and he followed. I went to SMU, so he wanted to come to SMU, and he actually played basketball in high school, and he didn't get a scholarship to play basketball here, but he did walk on. So he was on the basketball team, and contributing member to the basketball team, and I had ran track in college, and the track coach at the time was recruiting a guy out of El Paso who was a good athlete, was not that great a student. So the track coach recruited me to walk on, because I was getting an academic scholarship, so I didn't need an athletic scholarship. So he kind of recruited me to walk onto the team so I could kind of be a good influence on this star athlete, but who was not that good a student. And but it kind of worked the other way around. He had more of an effect on me than I had on him. And he was kind of somebody who liked to party, so I kind of followed in his footsteps a little bit. But the difference was that I would party, but I made sure that I took care of my schoolwork. In fact, my friends used to make fun of me because when I would go to parties off campus, I would take my books with me. I said, "Why are you taking your books?" Look, if we get put in jail, I'm serious. That was my thinking at the time. That's how serious I was about academics. But anyway, okay, that's enough of that.
How did you talked about your brother and you, how did you decide to go to SMU, and do you think that impacted him?
Actually, I always thought that I was going to go to an HBCU, a historically black college or university, and I was going to go to Howard. But actually, the thing that really attracted me to SMU, or made me start seriously thinking about SMU, was the fact that when I was getting ready to, I think my senior year in high school, SMU had recruited an African-American football player named Jerry Levias, who's, went on to play in the pros and what have you. And that year, the SMU football team was just so exciting. They had Jerry Levias, they had this little quarterback named Inez Perez, and they just kind of hooked up, and they were this dynamic duo. So I started following the football team, and started to get become more and more attracted to SMU, and and that's kind of was my initial interest. And then when SMU offered me a scholarship, that kind of, my father was like, okay, you can go to SMU where you're going to get your education paid for, or you can, go somewhere where, you might have to struggle to pay for your college education. So that's how it, and then plus, it was home, and I wasn't somebody who was just necessarily dying to get away from home. So it worked out okay.
And then what was your experience at SMU? How was making friends, all that kind of thing?
My experience at SMU as far as making friends, okay, now one way I would put it, one thing about SMU that facilitated making friends was the fact that there were so few African Americans that came in. I think when I came in '68, there were maybe like 8, 9, 10 people in my class who were African American. So in terms of making friends with African Americans, it made it easy because you tended to bond together because there were so few of you. So in that sense, it was easy to, in fact, you know, I mean, 50 years later, I'm still friends with most of those people that, you know, that I came in, entered SMU with. Now, as far as, you know, as far as just making friends in general, I didn't really have any, you know, I don't think there was much of a problem making friends. There were a lot of, now look, in 1968 things were still very conservative, and there were a lot of people who had very conservative ideas and what have you who weren't necessarily used to or comfortable around African Americans, but at the same time, there were a lot of students. This was in 1968. I mean, the world was in turmoil. There was the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the black, I mean, so there was a lot of things going on. So there were a lot of people who were becoming very conscious. And so there were a lot of white students who were, you know, eager to connect with and looking, you know, who had a sense of diversity and what have you. So as far as making friends, you know, for me, that was not an issue. And I don't really recall that would have been much of an issue for anybody. If you wanted to make friends, there were people there for you to you know, to connect with. So, I mean, yes, what I would say about that is just that was not an issue for me. There was nothing that unusual about it. Plus, for me, I had come from Irving High School, as I told you earlier, which was, I don't know, maybe, I'm gonna guess, there were maybe like 1,500 students in this high school, and there were like 4 or 5 African Americans. So I had been in an environment where I was, you know, in a similar kind of environment before. So for me, there was no culture shock or nothing like that. Now, for some students who came from predominantly black high schools or all black high school, there may have been an adjustment that I'm not aware of. But for me, there was not, you know, much of an adjustment at all.
So do you have any particularly great memories from SMU that you want to share?
Great memories?
Yeah, positive.
Man, you know, this is, you know, going back, that's a long time ago. That's like 50 years ago. I don't know about great memories. Let me, I'd have to think about that for a second. I mean, like I said, no, one of the great memories I have is just like I said earlier in terms of, I mean, there are friends that I've, you know, people that I formed friendships with that, I mean, here we are 50 years later and, you know, we're still, you know, very good friends. So that's one thing. I don't know, I mean, I tended to get involved. I mean, I was back then we called them sophomore advisors, where you, and I don't know if that's such a thing still exists, but in the residence hall you had a sophomore advisor, and then the next level you actually, and I don't remember what the title was, but where you actually were the student head of that particular floor, and I can't remember then whatever title that was, resident hall assistant or something like that, yeah. And so that was a good experience. You know, back then, in addition to, I'm trying to say in addition to, again, you have to, it's a long time ago, but I do know that, I know that it doesn't exist now, but back then there were 2 main organizations. There was AWS, Associated Women Students, which was an organization for all women. Then there was an organization called University Men, which was an organization that was basically for all men. And you know, each organization did programming for women, they did programming for men. And it was, you know, it was like almost on the same level with being president of the student body. And so, I don't know, somebody talked me into running for office and for president of University Men, and lo and behold, you know, I won. And so that was a very positive experience. You know, education I received was good. You know, so that's all I can think of right now. I'm sure there are lots of other experiences that that just aren't coming to mind right now.
Yeah, I'm sure. And then you mentioned there was an organization for men and women. Was there any organization in particular for like, African American students?
Yes, and I'm not quite sure, I can't remember to what extent it was in existence before I got here, but I know in 1968, when I got here, we actually formed an organization. The people, there were a couple of students, I can't remember how many, there were some students who had come in the year or two before, like in 67 and maybe 66. So, and that group plus the 7, 8, 9, 10 of us that came in 68, so there was, probably total wise, now this doesn't include athletes. There were always, a number of athletes, African American athletes, but actually we started an organization called, it was pronounced BLAACS, but the acronym was BLAACS, Black League of African American College Students. And so that organization was it was new. I mean, we kind of started it there in the fall of 1968, elected officers and that kind of thing. And so there was an organization. There was not a pre-existing organization, but in 1968 there was one that was started. And not everybody wanted to be involved with the organization. There were some, particularly the athletes who were on scholarship, they were concerned about, risking their scholarship if they, got involved in certain activities. So a lot of times, not every athlete, typically, as a general rule, athletes kind of shied away from that sort of getting involved in that sort of thing. And then there were a few students who who just were uncomfortable with a black student organization. And then there were others such as myself who, saw the need and were willing to join and participate and promote the goals of the organization.
So yeah, you mentioned the hesitancy among the black community joining the group. Was there any opposition from either white students or faculty?
Not that not overtly, no. No, I mean, we were able to, I'm presuming that we had to get some kind of charter or get approved, and I think we actually got some funding from maybe the student senate or somewhere. So no, there was no resistance to forming and starting the organization itself. Now, as time goes on, some of the goals or initiatives of the organization, I'm sure some people didn't necessarily, buy into. But there was no, not that I'm aware, there was no overt opposition that I could see. I'm sure there were people who were opposed, but I don't recall there being any difficulty in establishing the organization and moving forward.
And then as you wrapped up your time as a student, undergraduate student at SMU, you went to Kent State for law school, correct?
No. I went to SMU Law School.
Oh, you did? Okay.
No. And then, I mentioned that I had changed careers and got involved in college athletics. So when after graduating from law school and working for Sun Oil and actually, I had an experience. There was a guy that I worked with who organized this whitewater rafting trip down to New Braunfels. So we go down to New Braunfels and we're in this raft floating down the river, but the river was very calm, and which was fine with me. But the guy who organized, it just wasn't exciting enough for him, so he tried to create some excitement. So I was in a raft with him and somebody else, and there were some other people in other rafts, and we were approaching near the end of the ride, and there was this big, huge boulder that rose up above the water level about 3 or 4 feet. So for some reason, he decided to steer the raft into this, I don't know, big rock or boulder, whatever you want to call it, and somehow we all were thrown out of the raft. Now, right at where this rock was, there was a little drop off, and everybody else just got washed out into the water and just floated on down. I ended up on top of the rock in the middle of this river. And to make a long story short, at first, I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of cool. There are people on either side of the bank, just kind of watching, figuring out what am I going to do. I had a life vest on, and so I'm sitting on. Finally, I realized that I've got to find some way to get off this rock, and for some reason, even though the water was very calm, right around this particular rock, the water was just rushing as it would hit the rock, and there was a little drop off. So there was this. Anyway, I ended up trying to get off the rock and get into the water. Some people had managed to throw a rope out to me, and I think the thought was for me to tie the rope around the rock and just hang on to the rope. And okay, but anyway, so when I get off the rock, the next thing I know, I start to get just knocked down by the water, the currents of the water. And then I look up, and all of a sudden I see my life jacket has come off, and it's just floating out in front of me. So I grab it and clutch it, but the water's just knocking me to every time I come up. And I can swim a little bit, but the water was just so forceful I couldn't really do anything. And I actually thought that I was about to die. I really did. And I remember thinking to myself, now God, if it's my time to die, I really don't mind dying, but I do not want to die like this. I could see myself. And I thought this, I said, I don't want to be lying on the bottom of this riverbed, swelling up like a grape with water, so just not this way. And about that time, as soon as I finished that prayer, I felt something under my foot. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get out of this somehow. And somehow, I did manage to find a firm enough place to stand where I could stand up and my head was out of the water. And by this time, some people had got into a rowboat, a fairly large-sized rowboat, and they were rowing toward me. So when they get to me, I'm so tired, I can't even climb into the boat. All I can do is just hang over. My body's in the water, it's just my shoulders and my arms are hanging onto the boat. So when I get to when they get me to the bank, I didn't say a word to anybody, I just immediately left. Went to my car and drove to Dallas. And I don't know, that was like a turning point for me. It's like, look, life can be short, it's uncertain. You better do what you want to do. And I had always kind of wanted to get involved in athletics in some kind of way. I used to think that I wanted to be an agent, a sports agent. And so anyway, where all this is going, you mentioned Kent State. Right. Okay, and even though so once I decided that I was going to go to graduate school, and that's where I went to Kent State to get the degree in sport management, and that led to the NCAA and then ultimately to SMU and the athletic department. There's a long way to, well, I'm sure you can edit this and edit stuff out that you don't.
That's all great.
Okay, all right, okay.
And then did it just happen? You came back to SMU to work here, or?
You know what? Again, it's funny how things happen. And it lends itself to the notion that sometimes things are meant to be, or things happen for a reason. When I was at the NCAA, and I was in the compliance division. Okay, this was in 1988, 1989, somewhere along there. SMU, just a few years early, had received the death penalty. And so SMU was the first school to hire. Now everybody has a compliance officer now, but SMU was the first school to hire a compliance officer, someone to kind of manage this relationship between athletics and the NCAA. And the athletic director at that time was Forrest Gregg, who used to be a football player who played for the Green Bay Packers, famous guy. I didn't know him, but while I was at the NCAA, I came home to Dallas. I was working in Kansas City for the NCAA. I came home to Dallas, and I happened to come out to SMU. And there was a guy who I had gone to law school with. No, I'm sorry, I had gone to undergraduate school with. In fact, he was my sophomore. I mentioned sophomore advisors earlier. He was my sophomore advisor, and he was now the head of the the fundraising arm of the athletic department. I'm sure it has a name, but anyway, he was working. So I was surprised. As I was wandering around Moody Coliseum, he had an office in Moody Coliseum. I ran into him, and he said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Well, I'm at the NCAA, doing compliance, da 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 da." And he said, "Oh," and he didn't really say much. But what I didn't know, and what he knew at the time, was that the athletic director had grown, for whatever the reason, disenchanted with the person who was the compliance officer and wanted to hire somebody else. So apparently when when the athletic director and this former classmate of mine were discussing it, he said, "You know what? I know somebody who would be perfect." I just ran into an old friend who works at the NCAA Compliance. He has a law degree. He went to SMU, and next thing I know, here I was. So, I mean, the fact that he alerted the athletic director to my existence, I was contacted by the athletic director and asked me if I wanted to come in for an interview. I said, okay. So I came in for an interview, and after the interview, he said, "Do you want the job?" I said, "Sure, yeah. I mean, that's what I want to do." And so I had a start date. Now, what they did not tell me was that they had never even informed the current compliance officer that this was happening, that I was showing up. I just showed up one day, and I didn't know this at the time, and so it was a little uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable. In fact, I had applied for a job at University of California, and shortly after I agreed to accept the SMU job, I got a call from Cal saying, "Do you want to come for an interview?" And this was before I knew this other stuff, and I had said, "No, I've taken a job, da 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 da." And but once I got here and found out what the situation was, I thought, so maybe I should call Cal back and see if they're still, interested, because it was just very uncomfortable. So I thought that was a very poor way to handle things. They should have at least, but that tends to, I mean, I had no idea how much conflict there was between the compliance officer, current compliance officer, and then the athletic director. And so anyway, that was very uncomfortable. The plan was for her to take me under her wing and kind of, bring me along, get me up to speed so I could take over, I think the plan was to take over, 3 or 4 months later down the road. But, and everybody handles that situation differently, but she was not inclined to train the person who was going to be taken, and particularly the way that it was handled. And I tried to assure her, look, I didn't know, I had nothing to do with it. So I think she got a little upset, and then after I'd been here maybe like 3 weeks, the athletic director came to me and said, "Well, Charles, are you ready to take over?" It's okay, well, if I have to, I will. And, which is, it can be done. The NCAA has a manual about this thick, and that's why not everybody, but a lot of people who are compliance officers also have a legal background, because it's a quasi-legal kind of function. You can stop me anytime, because I can, ramble on about stuff. But so that was the start of my, working here at SMU.
So it started off on a little bit of the wrong foot.
Yes.
How did it go the rest of 11 or so years?
Well, there were, it went okay. There were good times and bad times. It was a lot of responsibility, because the compliance office was responsible for making sure that athletes were eligible, and there were a lot of regulations that had to be complied with in terms of student athlete eligibility. And for example, if I screwed something up, if there's something that I missed and an athlete became ineligible, you can imagine how the coach would feel about me. So, I mean, I would be, sometimes at night, at home, in the middle of the night, I would just wake up out of a dead sleep. God, did I remember to certify this? Did I remember to do that? I would have those kind of worries. I mean, fortunately, that never happened. But it was difficult, because even when there were no question of of a student athlete's eligibility, there were issues. A lot of times there were rules. There were things that coaches wanted to do, and I would have to tell them, no, that's against the rules. So that kind of created some conflict sometimes. But most of the coaches, even though they might get a little hot-headed at that moment, well, why can't I? But eventually they would realize that I'm just doing my job and that it was nothing personal. Now, for the most part, I loved my job. I loved it. It was stressful. I didn't enjoy the stress. And when I finally finished doing that job, I didn't realize how, happy I was to be free of all that stress. But toward the end, it got really ugly. There was a student, I got a call from the admissions office, I think, saying that there was a football player whose SAT score had been invalidated. And therefore, I'm thinking, okay, what is this about? And to make a long story short, once I looked into it, I realized that something funny was going on. And I won't go through the whole story because it's too long. But ultimately, the kid acknowledged to me that what had happened was he had taken the test. He didn't pass. He didn't make a passing score, to be eligible to play college athletics. So one of the football coaches paid another student to take the test for him, which is a no-no, of course. And my job is, I have to report this. That's just what I have to do. I suppose I could have finagled things in such a way that I could have swept it under the rug, because I knew that SMU would get in trouble. There would be some probation or something that might come from this. And but of course, I said, you have to do the right thing. You have to, because if you try to cover this up kind of way to protect SMU, and if it does come out, SMU's going to throw you under the bus. So anyway, so I reported it, and oh man, it got so ugly. The football coaches obviously were concerned because that was going to get them in trouble. So I guess it's okay to say all this stuff. So anyway, there was a plot to make it seem like I was out to get the football team, that I had put the student up to lying on, that I had convinced the student to lie on the coach. And they were trying to get the student to say that. But the student, and in fact, it got to the point where, and I didn't know this till later on, the coach had brought the student into his office. The coach had a tape recorder hidden in his drawer. He was trying to get the kid to say, so that he would have it on tape, that Charles Howard put me up to lie. But the kid, he would not do that. Now the kid did, I think the coach convinced him that they were going to get in a lot of trouble. So the kid did decide to change his story. He said, well, no, the coach didn't, that I, did all this on my own. The coach had nothing to do with it. But he would never say that I put the kid up to lie. So they, ultimately they were not able to pull that off. So it just got pretty ugly. The football coaches would not speak to me. It was just kind of crazy. It was a crazy situation. It got to the point where I was just so afraid that one time I was in Washington, D.C. visiting, doing something in Washington, D.C. I got a call that there was an alarm had gone off at my house. I thought, my first thought, these people not trying to break into. It had gotten that crazy that I was thinking like that. That didn't happen, and it was just kind of weird that they were trying to do that, and the way it ended up. We ended up. The NCAA came in, and well, actually, before this situation with this student athlete was resolved. At the end of each year, I had to do exit interviews with student athletes for graduating. So I did some exit interviews, and there were at least 5 other student athletes who said that, this same coach or some other coach had done something that violated NCAA rules. So I had to report that to the athletic director. So eventually, the NCAA got involved and came in and did an investigation. After the investigation was over, One day I got called into the athletic director's office, and it's like, well, Charles, thank you for your service, but goodbye. So, but anyway, and but it was, I didn't like the way it happened, but sometimes one door closes, another door opens up, and it was time to move on and do something else anyway. So, yeah, that was. I don't know. Sometimes when I think about it, I actually relive it in my mind, and actually, it was just strange the way that they thought that they might be able to. Now, I shudder to think what would have happened if they had somehow convinced the kid to say, "Look, you've got to say that Charles did this," and if he had said that, I mean, that would just. So I'm thankful to this day that he, was honest and would not. I mean, he changed his story to try to help the coaches, but he would not change it in such a way to make it seem like I had put him up to this. Why would I do that? That would make no sense. Who would do something like that? But anyway, moving right along.
So, after the SMU, did you retire, or what'd you go on to?
No, after SMU, I left SMU, and what did I do after I left SMU? Let me think back to then. Actually, after I left SMU, I kind of freelanced a little bit. I did, started to do more legal stuff, but still not wanting to set up a full-fledged practice. And then I ended up, I got involved with some people who were involved in the title insurance business, who wanted to start a title company, and they needed an attorney. So, they talked to me about it, and I ended up, agreeing to go to work with them, and that turned out to be problematic too. It's amazing. I'm thinking about it. I wonder if there's something about me that attracts these kind of situations. But ultimately, what I discovered with the title company situation. Now, I didn't have a lot of experience in the title business, but but I subsequently learned that one of the people who had gotten me involved, and one of the other principals, were doing something that were against Texas Department of Insurance rules and regulations that I didn't know about, and that they were keeping hidden from me. And then eventually, there was an investigation, and and obviously, I had to disassociate myself from them. I had to meet with the Texas Department of Insurance investigators and explain to them that, it was embarrassing me to have to say, look, I just didn't know. These people were doing this, and I had no idea. And whether they believe me or not, I'm not quite sure. But so anyway, I just that kind of. It got to the point where the primary person who kind of ran the office manager, who was also the closer, it was basically she and I who were there working all the time, and our relationship just became toxic. And she was, and at first I trusted her, which was, now that I look back on it, it was not the brightest thing to do, but like there would be checks that she would want me to sign. And because we had to, issue out a lot of checks, and then toward the end there, it was like she wanted me to sign checks. And after I kind of found out that there were some irregularities going on, she would want me to sign checks, and said, no, what are these for? She said, oh, well, we've got bills to pay. And I said, well, you know what? If you want me, actually, there was not enough money to pay the bills. She wanted me to front money to pay the bills, and then I would get reimbursed later. I said, well, if I'm going to pay for these bills, I need to know what they are. And so I started going through the bills, and I started finding things that were in my name, that had been set up in my name, that I knew nothing about. So anyway, that's kind of what I did after SMU. Did that for a while, and then after then, I started to, during this process, even while I was at SMU, and right after I left SMU, I still had tuition benefits. They let me keep those for a couple of years. I was taking, there was a graduate out at SMU in Legacy. They had a graduate level program for mediation, alternative dispute resolution, and which kind of tied into my legal background. So I had already, taken a lot of mediation courses. So I started to do mediations and subsequently went to work for a mediation service. And that's something that I still do to this day. I still, more so than legal work, I do more mediation and arbitration now than I do legal stuff. That kind of brings us up to the day, and that's for the last several years I focused more on mediation and arbitration. And then a year or so ago, year and a half ago, I decided that I think I'm going to just retire. And because I was one of these people, I always thought I'd work till I was 70 or till I dropped. And then I thought that with regard to, and this is way down the line for you, with regard to Social Security, the longer, and you may know this already, the longer you wait to earn your Social Security, the more money you earn. So I'm thinking, and then all of a sudden it hit me that I can wait till I'm 66, 67, 68 above to start collecting my Social Security. But there's no guarantee that I'm going to be living that long. And so anyway, so I just decided to retire. And even after you retire, you can still make money over and above what you give. So it's working out okay for me right now. I'm not even sure what you asked me.
That was great. So is there any final points you want to make?
Well, one of the things that we haven't discussed that I would think that some other people have brought up was that when I was here at SMU, and since this is a lot about SMU, with regard to, like I mentioned, the Black Student Organization, and one of the issues back then were the lack of, besides the number of students. I mean, the percentage of African American students was very low. When you looked around campus, there were very few, maybe one or two African American professors, no African American administrators that I recall. All the people who worked, all the people of color who worked at SMU were maids in the dormitories. Do they still have maids in dormitories now?
They have like something like that.
Okay, because back now, I thought that was really cool. I mean, I'm thinking, okay, God, you actually have a maid, and I'm going to come back to this, which reminds me of a little story. One time I was across campus, and there was a party, and we had started in my room. Like I told you, I was rooming with this student athlete from El Paso who was a track runner, who liked to have a good time. So we had started in my room, had been drinking, he liked Old English 800. And, but anyway, we used to buy, there used to be a place where you could go and buy quarts of Old Milwaukee, 3 quarts for $1. So we would hustle up, enough to get 4 quarts, $12 and get a bunch of quarts. So anyway, so we leave my room and our room, we go to this little party across campus, and I get a little inebriated, and I don't want to, that's not something I'm prone to do. I don't, do a lot of drinking. But anyway, I got inebriated and ended up sleeping on the bathroom floor in this place. I assume I was on the bathroom floor because I could be close to the commode in case I needed to throw up. And when I woke up, all the thing I could think about, God, when the maid comes in, she's going to see all these beer bottles and beer cans. I've got to get across campus. I stagger across campus. Then when I get there, I realize, this is Saturday. They don't even come in on Saturday. But anyway, so it was amazing that we had maids. That was just, obviously something new to me. But anyway, so most of the people were either maids or they worked in the cafeteria. And so, and I'm sure someone has mentioned this. So in the spring of '69, and this was going on at a lot of campuses around the country. I mean, students were in revolt over, civil rights issues, women's issues, the war, Vietnam War. It was just crazy. And so we kind of got caught up in some of that, and we put together a list of demands that were going to be presented to the university. So we go to, at the time, President Tate was the president of the university. So we arranged to meet with him to discuss these demands. So we go into his office, and there's, about, I don't know, I can't remember, 12, 15 of us. And so we're talking back and forth, doing kind of negotiating. And at some point, we asked him to leave the room so we could discuss. So when he leaves the room, he never comes back. And what I learned later on was that the decision had been made that he was going to leave and go do whatever he was going to do, and we were told that we needed to leave his office, and that if we didn't leave by a certain time, I mean, they were prepared to come in and remove us. And so that was very interesting because, I mean, I'm in President Tate's office. I remember sitting at his desk, picking up the phone, because by now, I mean, this was big news back then. Today, I don't know if that would be such big news, but back then, so there were news cameras and everything, and there were students who weren't a part of what we were doing, I mean, who were not up there with us, but who were supportive, who were down on the ground. And a lot of them were, you know, most of them were white students because there were very few black students to begin with. And so it was just like almost a carnival-like atmosphere. And so I knew by now that it was on the news, that my father would know. So I called him up to let him know that I was okay. And his attitude was, "Are you crazy? What are you doing? You know, all right, you mess around, you lose that scholarship. I cannot pay for you to go to SMU. You're going to end up out of da-da-da-da-da-da-da." So, and at the time, it's like, well, if that happens, that just happens. This is something I believe in. And there were a couple other people who called their parents and went through the same kind of thing. And I don't know, finally about 5 o'clock, we had been there since about 10 o'clock in the morning, finally about 5 o'clock that afternoon, we decided, I don't remember exactly what happened, why we decided to leave. We decided, okay, we've done all we can do, let's leave. And but eventually some good stuff did come out of it. Eventually there were some further negotiations, and there was, they brought in a few more African American faculty members. They did hire an African American person to be like a, I don't remember what a specific title was, but he was kind of like a liaison between, you know, the African American community. Irving Baker, yes, which was, you know, which was a story all in and of itself. Again, I don't, you know, Irving Baker was, you know, well respected, you know, an intelligent man, but, you know, but in the final analysis, he was hired by the university. He was not, even though he was hired to be this liaison, and so there were times when he tended to lean toward the university. So that created some hostility between him and some of the African American students, but, you know, that's the way it was. But eventually, you know, and then they started to hire more African American faculty members. They, you know, made an effort to recruit more African American students. So some good stuff did come out of it. Now, with regard to some of the other personnel, they did. Some of the people in the residence hall, some of the maids and that worked in the residence halls, a few of those were promoted to a higher level position. I don't think they changed their income or their pay level or anything. But anyway, so some stuff did come out of it, so it wasn't a wasted effort whatsoever. There were issues with, and I'm sure surely someone else has brought this up. There was a fraternity, a particular fraternity on campus. They were called and they probably still here, the Kappa Alphas. And I don't have no idea where they stand now, but back then, their whole, every year they had this Old South Week, where they would actually, you know, have a ball where they would dress up in, you know, in the Confederate outfits and, you know, the big gowns and the Southern Belle gowns, and then they had this huge rebel flag that was, I mean, as big as this room, where they would just, I mean, it would be it was large enough to hang down over the house. I mean, you could see it for miles around, and that was a problem because obviously that was not something that was something that you know, you might understand that some people would find offensive. Not just African American, there were white students who found it offensive too. You know, not as much so then as would be now. And then I never saw this. Now I heard that they would actually have little fake slave auctions. You know, just doing the whole Old South thing. And there was a confrontation where there were some demands by the Black student organization that this flag come down. And they said, no, it's not coming down. So the deal was that, okay, well, we will come take it down. But then, no, I mean, I remember when we were gathered, could see the flag. Their house was, I'm sure, it's not there anymore. I know it's been torn down. But anyway, we could look down the boulevard that runs in front of Hughes Trigg now, and you could see the flag, and we were congregated. And somehow there was some kind of the dean of students somehow intervened and got things resolved. But it was almost kind of touch and go there for a while. Let me think if anything else comes to mind. I mean, nothing else really comes to mind at the moment. I'm sure if we, sat here long enough, and I'm sure you've got things to do, and I do too. But overall, I would say. And I don't know how other people feel about this. Overall, I think my experience here at SMU was overall a positive one. I mean, there were some issues, obviously that I, referenced, but overall, I don't regret my decision to come to SMU. Now, I know some African American students who are glad they went to SMU and glad they have the degree, but they feel no attachment to it once they leave. Now I have felt some attachment to SMU, and have over the years, been involved in the Alumni Association and done different things, and so overall my experience was a positive one. SMU. It's particular if you're going to stay in Dallas. And at the time, thinking that I was going to be an attorney, if I was going to be in Dallas, to say that I went to SMU Law School, that would open many doors. So there was a practical side to it too. But overall, I enjoyed my college experience and would not trade it for the world. As I sit here, certain memories start to flood back in. Just in terms of issues, now I don't know how this stuff is handled today, but I remember there were concerns about like homecoming dance, and I don't know if they do that now, but back then, every year during homecoming, there was a big event. Homecoming is always big, but there was always a headline entertainer who was brought in to perform somewhere, and one of the issues were that the people on the committee planning for homecoming, there were no people of color in that. So obviously, when they picked entertainment, they would come up with forms of entertainment that they were more accustomed to, and so I remember that was a big issue too, because a lot of African American students wouldn't want to participate in homecoming because they didn't feel like it included them, that kind of thing. But anyway, that's all I can think of right now. I'm sure I probably bored you guys to death.
No, we really appreciate you coming out.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Unless you have any further questions for me, I can't think of anything else to add right now.
No, that's great. You've done a great job. We really appreciate your insight.
All right. Thank you.